Hello. In this video, I want to talk about sacrificing artifacts in Cube. Now, if you have a typical cube or a powered cube or something in that area, you probably have a lot of artifacts in your cube. Some people even make artifact-centric cubes. And there's basically two main components, plus a third minor one I'll talk about at the end, that goes into sacrificing artifacts. Number one, you have to have a way to sacrifice them. And then number two, you have to have something to sacrifice. So, first I've just got a simple search here on Scryfall that probably isn't perfect, but it just shows you how many different cards there are that exist where you can sacrifice an artifact. Maybe some of these aren't really artifact sacrifice outlets, so you'd want to investigate some of them yourself, but there's definitely a lot of legitimate ones here that you can browse through. So I'll just switch over to the ones that I'm running and we can kind of dive into them. I've kind of got this messy search up here, but moving on, we've got Tinker. This is probably the most iconic artifact sacrifice card ever, and certainly the most powerful. So it's definitely something to be aware of if you're going to include it. Is it too powerful for what your environment wants to do? And it goes without saying, for all these, you need to have some kind of fodder to sacrifice so you can get it going. And you also want to have a big payoff in the case of Tinker. If you're playing 3 mana and sacrificing an artifact, and the biggest artifacts in your cube are 4 mana, maybe it's not that good. But this is maybe a card that doesn't really need an introduction, but as you can see, it's very, very powerful, and it's really the only one in blue. Pretty much all these are centered in black and red. They're kind of the premier sacrifice colors, at least these days. Maybe that'll change someday. Moving on to Umbral Collar Zealot. Sacrifice another creature or artifact, and you get to Surveil. For 2 mana and a 3/2, I mean, it's pretty good, especially in black where you have lots of little creatures running around, and this is a nice way to get some cards into your graveyard or just card selection to ensure that your draw is going to be relevant. Braids. This is not a direct sacrifice outlet, but it does let you sacrifice on your upkeep. This is kind of an archetype all unto itself, and I'll scroll down real quick to grab Smokestack. So they're kind of in the same vein where they kind of try to win by attrition. And if you have a bunch of artifact trinkets that you're able to generate kind of incidentally, then that's a good way to break parity on those. Deadly Dispute. Sacrifice an artifact or creature, draw 2 cards, create a treasure for 2 mana at instant speed. What's nice about this one is it also creates an artifact, so it's kind of playing from both sides. So if you're going to want to include these types of synergies in your cube, this one's a great one to consider. And you'll notice several cards on this list here do that, where they make artifacts and they can sacrifice artifacts. So they're kind of self-synergistic in a way. Same goes with Pia and Kiran Nalaar. Creates 2 artifacts when it comes into play, and you can pay 3 and sack an artifact to hit something for 2. Now, paying 3 to sacrifice an artifact is kind of a heavy price, but it is an army and it can, and it's nice to have that option. Demand Answers. This is very similar to Deadly Dispute. I guess I don't have to read the cards, you can read them, but there's not much to say about this one. But it does have the option to discard a card instead, so it does go in more decks than just, ones where you have artifacts lying around. Shrapnel Blast. This one's interesting because it's a card that was kind of around for a while, and it didn't see much play because it didn't have enough, targets. But with a lot of cards that have come out that have been interesting, at least that I've added to my own cube, it's kind of, come back into the limelight. So that's one thing that's interesting about Cube is cards that, when they were printed and they were sitting around for years and maybe they didn't have a place, maybe later on they become relevant. But, 2 mana for 5 damage, especially when you can go face, is pretty sweet. Legion Extruder, this is another one that plays from both sides, because even though it doesn't make an artifact, it is an artifact. So it's good to come into play, deal 2 to something, and you could use it as a sack outlet, but you can also use it as fodder for maybe your shrapnel blast. So this one's playing from both sides, which is great. Arc Button Ravager, also an artifact, and you can sack artifacts to grow it. What's great about a lot of these is they can do it at instant speed, which, doing things at instant speed is just good in general, but it's especially relevant for another card later on that I'm going to talk about. Threefold Thunderhulk, this one, I mean, technically it is a sacrifice outlet, but it is 7 mana, so this is more of a tinker target, if you will. And it, comes into play, it makes its own artifacts, and you can basically end the game if your opponent doesn't have an answer for it. So maybe this one really you wouldn't consider a sacrifice outlet, since you're just trying to win the game with it. Smokestack we already covered. Duretti, this is another one that makes artifacts with its plus ability, and then its -1 ability you can sack an artifact, and you can destroy any creature or artifact, which is pretty nice. Moving on to Korvold, maybe you wouldn't think of him as a artifact sacrifice outlet, but you can sacrifice any permanent when he comes into play or attacks. He also has this last ability here, which is really great. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold and draw cards. So that kind of goes into what I want to talk about at the very end, where there's this third element of, sacrifice payoffs, essentially. And then closing out, we have Breya. She's another one of these ones that comes in, makes artifacts, and also is a sack outlet. And if you really need to, she is an artifact, so you could sacrifice her. So she's kind of got it all, but she is 4 colors. Before I said if your biggest artifact was 4 mana, maybe Tinker wouldn't be great, but I think if you tinkered out a Breya, that's still pretty strong. And I want to go back real quick to Threefold Thunderhulk here and compare him to another cube classic. This is more of a sideline on the video, but I like him over Myr Battlesphere. Myr Battlesphere is kind of a classic in cube, and it's certainly strong. But I like the Thunderhulk because it plays with +1/+1 counters. It can sacrifice artifacts, so I just feel like it goes in more decks. They're both worthy tinker targets or reanimate targets that can close out a game all by themselves pretty quickly. Maybe Myr Battlesphere has more raw power to do that because of this long-winded second ability here, where you can untap Myr, and not only can you attack with it and make it maybe an 8/7, but you can also deal 8 to their face before it even connects for 8. It does have a minor downside if you care about this, but I don't like that it might tell your drafters that there's other Myr in the cube, even though this is probably the only Myr in your cube. Maybe you've got 1 or 2 more that you're running incidentally, but I don't believe I have any in my cube. So, they might be looking for Myr and they won't find any. So, you can certainly run both, but I do think Threefold Thunderhulk's a little underplayed. Maybe because he's a new kid on the block, at least compared to Myr Battlesphere. Alright, and then getting into artifacts that you might want to sacrifice. So here's another kind of crude Scryfall search. There's 583 artifacts that have triggers when they enter, or when they die, or when they leave the battlefield. So they're, candidates for sacrifice. Now, of course, you wouldn't want to sacrifice all these. Maybe the One Ring or some of these 7 mana ones you wouldn't want to sacrifice, but this is a good jumping off point for you to kind of start looking for artifacts that are, worth sacrificing. Also, you don't have to sacrifice an artifact that wants to be sacrificed. You can sacrifice any old artifact. So here are cards that make artifacts. Most of the time those are going to be treasures or clues, or maybe just like 1/1 servos or thopters or something. So there's a whole bevy of these. And of course, maybe you just play an artifact that costs 1 or 2 mana and does a little something, and it can be sacrificed in an emergency. So long story short, with these two is there's no shortage of options for artifacts or artifact creation to choose from. But there are some artifacts that I think are especially worth considering, and that would be this kind of group here, where they are cheap, and they either want to be sacrificed or they, come into play or leave play and they kind of get the full value. You could certainly find more if you peruse this list here. And I encourage you to do that if you're looking for more of these. But these are just the ones I'm running. I guess I should cut back to this one real quick. So I talked about cards that make artifacts, and this is all the ones I'm running. So I have 30 in my cube that make artifacts, and that's on top of cards that are artifacts themselves. So it's a target-rich environment. But yeah, let's go over these real quick. So Cryogen Relic is new, at least at the time of this video. And what I like about this one is it has a trigger when it enters or leaves the battlefield, you draw a card. So if you can sacrifice it, you get to draw 2 cards for 2 mana. Now it does have its own way to self-sacrifice. It's maybe not super strong, but it is an option. Another thing worth noting is it doesn't have to die for you to get the other card draw. It just has to leave the battlefield. So that's great with lots of white cards that might flicker something. And blue has lots of ways to return permanents to your hand. So you could easily get a bunch of card draw from this if you build around it. So I think this is pretty, innocuous, but it's actually got a lot of potential. And then here's Grim Bauble, 1 mana, do 2 damage to a creature. Well, shrink a creature. It also has a built-in sacrifice, so that's nice. Legion Extruder, we already covered this one. Solemn Simulacrum, this is a classic. It is 4 mana, but it does have an ETB and a trigger when it dies, so totally a good candidate. And for any creatures that want to be sacrificed, I guess I only have these 2. What's nice is they can come in, you can set up a block with them, and since a lot of the sacrifice outlets can be activated at instant speed, you could set up a block and then sacrifice them, so you could generate a lot of value that way. Chromatic Star, this one's also nice on its own. It comes into play, and well, I guess it doesn't do anything, but you could sacrifice it to add a mana, and when it is put into a graveyard, you draw a card. So you could, that trigger's independent from its top one. Ichor Wellspring, this one's maybe most emblematic of the genre. It literally has no other abilities other than when it comes in or when it's put into a graveyard, you draw a card. So maybe technically it's worse than Cryogen Relic, but it is colorless, so it can go in any deck. It's also easier to cast. And there's other cards in this vein. Maybe we'll try to find kind of its cousins here. Instead of doing a Scryfall search, I'll do just a quick Wellspring search. So there's also Mycosynth Wellspring. When it enters or is put into a graveyard, you get to search for a basic land, so that's another option. There's also plenty of ones that are kind of like this. You could search for this and go to the Scryfall tagger and find its buddies. This one comes into play and you get a treasure, and then when it goes into the graveyard, you get the same thing. There's also ones that make well, maybe it's Servo Schematic. So this one's actually pretty good because it comes into play and makes an artifact, and then when it dies, you make another artifact. So that one's got a lot of potential if you really want to lean into artifacts, but I'm only running the Wellspring just because I think drawing cards is the most powerful of all those options. And I touched on Baleful Strix already. It comes in, it draws a card, and you can set up a little block with it. It also does have Death Touch, so maybe they wouldn't want to attack you in the first place. And then Tangle Wire is maybe the most interesting one on the list, and it might not look like something that wants to be sacrificed on the surface. I think this card's, first of all, just underplayed in general. It can go in an aggro deck or a control deck because it essentially time walks your opponent if you play it, on curve. So it comes in with 4 fading counters, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove one. And then when the last one's removed, you sacrifice it. And then at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they tap an untapped artifact, creature, or land for each fade counter. So imagine you play this for 3, you pass to your opponent, they've got to tap 4 things between artifacts, creatures, lands. That's essentially going to mean they tap their whole board, and they're not going to be able to cast anything. So then they're going to pass back to you. And you can stack the triggers so you remove a fading counter first, and then you have to tap 3 things. And one of the things you can tap would be Tangle Wire. So then you have to tap 2 more things. So you'll have at least 1 land, and maybe you can drop another land and maybe play a 1 or a 2 drop. But even if you can't, you pass back to the opponent. They've got to tap 3, so you're basically coming out way ahead in this exchange. And going back to what I said before, a lot of these sacrifice outlets are at instant speed, so you could play this maybe with 2 spare mana, or maybe you've already deployed a sacrifice outlet, then you play Tangle Wire. You give your opponent a pseudo Time Walk, and then before your upkeep, you sacrifice Tangle Wire. So it just has a lot of different avenues for getting value. So I definitely think you should consider Tangle Wire for your cube, especially if you have a way to sacrifice artifacts. And then closing up here, just that third little element that I hinted at earlier with Korvold is there are cards that care about you sacrificing, and I've described the ones that care about when you sacrifice artifacts or permanents. There's obviously ones that care about sacrificing creatures. I do run Mayhem Devil. There's lots of ways to sacrifice things in my cube, between fetch lands or maybe sacrifice creature outlets that are mostly in black. But there's 43 of them here. You can maybe loosen this search if you want to sacrifice, search for any kind of sacrifice energies. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting options here. Jury is also pretty good. So hopefully I've provided some food for thought. I'm sure I missed some awesome sacrifice outlets and maybe some fodder. So I'd love to hear, maybe your favorites. Also, if I'm running any that you think are silly, let me know. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.